Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 111 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I want to jump straight into today's show because it is such an not exciting, but such a valuable topic. And I have one of our favorite guests back on the podcast today. Vikram Jeet Singh is no stranger to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. He has been on numerous times. And if you are a regular listener of the show, you already know who Vikram is. And if you are a brand new listener, then I would suggest you finish this conversation and then listen to all the others that we have done. Each one of them is so valuable. And Vikram is not only knowledgeable and wise, but he's incredibly generous in offering his insight to yoga teachers and yoga students. And he suggested we do this topic on cultural appropriation. I've stayed away from it from a couple of years because I've done this before. But the reason I stayed away from it, and you'll hear us talk about this in the show itself, is because I feel like the yoga world is indulging too much in just the superficial, easier aspects of appropriation, right? Should we say namaste or not? Should you have Ganesha in your studio? Should you play devotional chants during yoga classes? And I believe the real work in appropriation is deeper, okay? And it's harder work. And so we have a very open and honest conversation about right from what is appropriation to examples of appropriation. And Vikram brings up types of appropriation, which I think is very important for us to recognize. What are the major issues we face when it comes to appropriation? And very significantly, the qualities a yoga teacher needs to embody to actually start genuine appropriation work. Right. And the importance of context. I quiz him about the need for Indianness to do this type of work. And does that add value? How much money should you spend or should you be paying a lot of money to learn about appropriation? Because a lot of yoga teachers are building their career solely on appropriation of yoga. So we talk about that. We talk about missteps that yoga teachers could take while trying to sincerely do some appropriation work, what it should look like, what it shouldn't look like, what appropriation looks like in India today, and some homework for you, the listeners, to take away at the end of this long but very significant conversation. So there's a lot in here. As always, you'll find everything that we talk about linked at letstalk.yoga in the show notes, especially all the other episodes that Vikram has been on, including his website and Instagram handle. And if you found today's conversation valuable, I would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. It's really what moves the needle for us and helps us to keep providing this free resource to yoga teachers and to continue the work we do. And that's about it. I will see you on the other side. Enjoy this conversation with Vikram. Hi, Vikram. Welcome back to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast.
Hi, Aru. Thank you for having me back again. I should just stop saying that. I should just say thank you for having me because this is one of my favorite places to be, to share my thoughts, to chat with you about all things yoga. So yeah, thank you.
You know, I have forgotten how many times you have come on this podcast, and I think I'm just going to stop counting at this point. But I'm glad you are here, and especially for this topic, because this is something that I know resonates very deeply with both of us. And I'm calling it cultural appropriation 2.0. Okay. But that's because we spoke about this. I did a cultural appropriation podcast right at the start, about more than 2 years ago, when the podcast first launched. And it was a hot topic. Okay. And it was specifically a topic that we as Indian yoga teachers get questions about. So, but I haven't really gone back to it since, because I feel like in the past few years, especially since the murder of George Floyd, I feel like that's when in the modern popular yoga industry, there was this whole push for being more inclusive and diverse. And suddenly you saw all these yoga teachers being recognized. And I'm doing that in air quotes. So I feel like we haven't really done the real work. We've done some amount of work, mostly, if I may say so, a lot of superficial work. Because when I'm looking at what has really moved, I don't know if anything's really moved other than some tokenism here and there. And I could be wrong. I feel like people are still looking at, oh, should we or should we not say namaste? And I was telling you this before we recorded, right? I still get emails, I'm sure you do too, about should I say namaste or not? And I feel like it's become a very convoluted topic in many ways. People are not sure where to go to really do cultural appropriation work. Okay. And how to recognize what's happening. And then there is this whole new stream of yoga teachers who are building a business and career purely on appropriation, right? And then there is political activism that has gotten so intertwined with yoga and cultural appropriation. So what am I really trying to ask you here? I don't know. Okay. At the start of this card thing, I'm just venting to you at some point. But where do we start? Because this is such a significant, valuable, and needed conversation. But where do we start? Should we start with defining appropriation? Where do you want to start this?
I think that's a good place to start. So I wrote down a few things, right, just to kind of keep me on track. So if you look at a few working definitions, so I would say cultural appropriation, specific, largely speaking, not necessarily speaking about yoga right now, just on its own, the term. So it could refer to the use of objects or elements of a non-dominant culture. And the use, it doesn't respect the original meaning. In most cases, does not give credit to the source. It reinforces stereotypes, or it contributes or supports free and existing oppression. And by default is laying the seeds for further oppression. So I see it as a vicious cycle. You can also use it to describe the practice of taking aspects, selective aspects. And now I could be speaking specifically about yoga, and using them or profiting off them without reference, without reverence or deference to that culture. And in most cases, even cutting ties. So cutting ties from the source culture. So you take little pieces, make a little mini collage, and then you cut ties from the source culture. It could also involve misrepresentation of the culture by showing them as an other. And that other, we see it in mainstream media, we see it in caricatures. You either exoticize them, or you romanticize them, or you make them look primitive, savage, demonic. And I think the last thing I would say is appropriation can be used with someone who has systematic power to almost give the culture an identity or a stereotype that the suppressed, oppressed culture does not have a strong enough voice to fight back and refute it. So not only have you moved them, not only have you cut the link that ties a culture to its original source, you've cut the link and given it your own interpretation of it. And you have a stronger voice, a louder voice. So now that is your new identity, whether you like it or not.
There's so much there. And I really hope that the listeners just pause, go back and listen to that, because right there you gave us a really clear understanding of what appropriation is. And it has seeped so deeply into yoga, right? That many practitioners don't even realize that what they are doing is practicing an appropriated version of yoga itself. But just in case somebody's really new to this conversation, can you give us some examples of what appropriation can look like in a modern day yoga studio or in a teacher training, or just is there any tangible examples that if someone is like, hey, what is this? Anything that comes to your mind?
I would say that the biggest example that I see that I get questions on is this new yoga culture that we see. This new yoga culture that everyone is magically supposed to conform to, and that has decided the new standards. And unfortunately, that new yoga culture is built around little pieces that are being taken to put together to represent a much larger piece, but super condensed. And it's almost like the structure around it is designed to keep you in that little loop. So anything that you want to know, that you're curious to know, is outside of the scope. So perfect example is, learning stories of asana names. But it just ends there. It doesn't go any beyond that. It doesn't go beyond the asanas. It's almost that that's all that you need to know. Or for example, a chant, some sort of chant that the practice is starting with, and then kind of leaving it there, not encouraging, not fostering growth or continuity. I think that to me is the most pervasive example that I see in most teacher trainings, in most conversations of this genre.
I think you just said it in passing, but it's so important. There is no growth or continuity, right? And I'm trying not to get into that tangent of how, because we don't have high quality yoga education or access to teachers who have high quality educating backgrounds, right? There is this dead end. And like you said, we're circling the same thing and we're trying to come up with new things from that little pool. So are there types of appropriation that people should know about, or degrees of appropriation?
Yes, to some extent. So there is tangible artifacts, statue of Ganesha. If I look at indigenous with a capital I, not just, someone who belongs to a certain culture, smudging, incense sticks, tangible artifacts that you see all around, little manjira, little kirtan symbols, picture of Om, things that are very tangible and belong to a certain culture. So using that to kind of fit the bill, to fit the image, but not being invested to go through with the rest of it. You are of Indian descent, you know that we don't just take an idol and place it and then forget about it. It's a whole sthapna. You're inviting the deity of your choice, to physically live in your space and bless your space and remove obstacles, right? It's mostly Ganesh. But then you see it covered with cobwebs, no puja done, no rituals done, no one's taking care of it. So those would be some tangible examples. And then you have intangible examples, which would be customs, rituals that have been taken from a source culture. So typically in yoga, I would say, let's say the practice of, I often get involved in these conversations also, or should we be chanting Om or not?
Yes.
Well, is that the space to chant Om? And do you normally chant Om in other facets, other places in your life? Almost, like I said, I go back to this new culture that we have created, or that modern yoga has created, and everyone has to conform to it. And no one really knows where it started. At least I don't. I try and go back in time and figure it out, but I don't know where it started. So I would say that tangible, intangible, intellectual property rights, but it gets a little dicey there. I say this in my lectures. Who owns yoga? It's not like champagne or not like mozzarella. Who owns yoga? We can trace its origin. We can find the first codified scriptural reference. The word is there in the Rig Vedas, but we can find it in the Katha Upanishad. But who owns it? Because there is this whole thing about intellectual theft or intellectual property rights, and it's not that black and white. So who owns it, right? And I would say that the other way appropriation sometimes in terms of hierarchy would be the extraction, the selective extraction, where one leaves things that don't fit your agenda. I'll give a very small example here because it just came to my mind. Everyone speaks about the yamas and the niyamas, right? And that's great. It's a wonderful concept. It's a wonderful piece of the larger yoga piece. I, on a chart recently, saw Ishvara Pranidhana translated as stay humble. And it's a beautiful thought. It's a beautiful sentiment. But why not just write stay humble? Because Ishvara Pranidhana, I can join the dots as can you, as can
Mhm.
any intelligent being who
Mhm.
understands the meaning of Ishwar, the two words, Ishvara Pranidhana. You
Mhm.
can join the dots and you can come to
Mhm.
the conclusion that it also means stay humble. So I'm not
Mhm.
refuting that. But you just took out Ishvara, you took out Pranidhana, you took out, I'm just going to say the supreme being, surrender, acceptance, obeisances, any of those translations, and made it into stay humble. And for someone who is brand new to that, who does not have, let's say, the desire, maybe the financial capacity, maybe not the time to go deep,
Mhm.
that's their version of Ishvara Pranidhana.
It's
So
oversimplified.
it's oversimplified
Mm.
and it's easy, right? Because
Mm.
God is not in the picture, so it's easy. You have
Yeah.
created, I think you wrote something about it a while ago. Accessibility versus adaptability. So
Yeah.
I fully believe in making all of these teachings accessible. It's at the foundation of my teachings. I write very
Mhm.
simply. I speak very
Mhm.
simply. But
Mhm.
accessibility does not mean exclusion. Because
Yes.
right now,
Mhm.
in order to make something accessible, you excluded a lot of people, a lot of translations, and
Mhm.
and a lot of people's cultural identity that is tied to
Yes.
that.
Mhm. 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 I'm trying to write some notes very quickly, but uh, it's this whole idea of cherry picking what you think is important, or what will enhance your yoga career, because that is something we haven't gotten into, but that is such a big part of what's happening in the modern yoga realm here, right? With appropriation, it's such a common thing that I feel it's a common problem, and I think a lot of us have just accepted that as the norm, right? That we're just being handed over certain tiny fragments of yoga that somebody thought is relevant, and not contextualizing and leaving, and I would say excluding te- people like us who can give them more context, right? I've been in situations where people will deliberately not let you in because you will call out and say certain things like, hey, but this is not okay. This is not yoga in many ways. This is just a tiny fragment, and there's got to be greater context to it. But I really enjoy your perspective of tangible versus intangible. I think for the listeners, that segregation should help, because the tangible ones like the Ganesha idol and playing some chants in class, all of those are things that you can really do something about on a easier scale, right? Like less effort. um, the intangible aspects is much harder, and that is why I think you and I are having this conversation at some level, because that's where I feel you got to put in more. Comes down to the individual, right? And how much effort and value they attach to this work. And it's very easy to say, yeah, I understand. Oh, too bad. And post one Instagram reel about appropriation or something, but not really do the groundwork, the one that really enhances your own mindset and your own understanding of yoga. Um, so I don't think there's a question there. Okay. I'm just telling you, I think a lot of this episode will be me venting to you. So just feel free to reel me back in. But I want to, I want us to explore, if possible, what does, what should one, what qualities should one embody? Okay. Uh, to go into appropriation work. And what is this appropriation work that I'm talking about? Does that mean we start to do, if I'm pulling definitions and stuff like that, cultural appreciation of yoga? Is that what we're looking at? And do we first have to be like, hey, this is real? I'm going to say this, it's reverence work, right? Because I revere what yoga so much, this means something to me. Hence, here's my checklist of things I need to embody, things I need to make sure I have done before I actually start deep work.
Good question. So I would say, this is great. You and I are chatting. We've known each other a while. So
Mhm.
it's an easy, free flowing conversation. But what's at the basis of this conversation is engagement. None of this work can be done as a downloadable MP3 file.
Yes.
It's not about a lecture that I would give or someone else would give or you would give, right? It's something that requires, it's a two-way street. So there has to be engagement and participation from both parties involved. And this is also a conversation, not just between, in this case, it's between two Indian people. It's between two teachers, since you and I teach, two teachers, two brown teachers, two Indian yoga teachers. No, this is a conversation that goes beyond any label. I'm just going to say that, any label, because it involves all of us. I, as an Indian yoga teacher, can very easily be implicit in the system without knowing that I'm contributing to the system as opposed to fighting it. And I'll speak to more of that later. And this is also not a guilt trip if you're a teacher, not of color, So this is not a shaming, accusatory kind of work. So that has to be out. If you're coming here to get angry, if you're coming here to get angry, scream, shout, there's other venues, other outlets for that, but not at the foundation of this work. I think the other thing is that when it comes to the table, and I do this all the time, right? You come to the table being aware of all the identities you have, spiritual, religious, ethnic, political, because those identities have shaped a worldview. Chances are that if you and I made a checklist of the kinds of yoga that are out there, and let's say you and I had our backs to each other and we said, okay, go ahead and cross the ones that don't belong. I'm not a gambling person, but I think you and I would cross out more or less the same ones, right?
Yeah.
Because from our conversation, you and I might have a lot of difference of opinions, but we have more or less a similar ethical worldview. Because at the end of this conversation, my thoughts around this are don't do it. To me, they don't align. So I want to talk about it and raise awareness and say, how does that land in your worldview? Because that worldview is different than mine. When I look at some advertising, when I look at a person in a particular advertisement, I know that, everyone knows yoga teachers don't make a lot of money, right? But you could pay me a lot of money, but I still wouldn't do it. I would not compromise my ethics for that because that's defined by my worldview. Correct. So I think coming to the table with a genuine desire to talk, to engage, to participate, to be aware of your own conditioning, coming to the table with that and knowing that, it's not all love and light. It's not good vibes only.
Please, yes.
Yeah. So as long as we can meet with that attitude, we are in business.
Okay. I've noticed there are two sides to this. One is the live and light and good vibes only, which are people who don't want to do a certain type of work. Okay, because it's a form of escapism for me. Okay, where it's like good vibes only. Oh, let it be. Love and light. It's a phrase I just cannot understand. Love and light. It doesn't even mean anything. Okay, and then there is the other side, which sometimes I wonder who's doing more harm. The side that uses anger, to rile people up, and I think it is because of social media culture and the popularity game that everybody tries to play. And I feel like sometimes that causes more harm. And it comes down to people recognizing the qualities that a teacher is embodying or displaying while doing this work, right? If somebody is going to use, political trends and anger and hatred and all of that to get you in, then I question it because I've been taught differently, right? I look for yoga teachers who really embody empathy, compassion, the ability to listen to the other side without having the need to be right. And to put aside that ego and approach this type of work. And that there is this need to be right. And I know better and I know more. And I feel like that's gotten those are such big red flags. If yoga teachers can just identify, go a little deeper and see. I've always said how a teacher makes you feel, right? Especially if they're able to make you reflect, not tell you what to do, but make you reflect, then that's a very important sign. If they teach you to observe yourself and be more reflective, not be like, okay, this is how it's interpreted, now this is what you should do. But let you decide, give you that give you the tools and be like, now you decide. I think that is something that is important when we talk about worldview, right? And I think teachers have to create their own base first before just blindly thinking, oh, this person has 100,000 followers, hence they must be knowing what they're doing, right? I've always said this on the podcast that the best yoga teachers don't have Instagram accounts, and I mean,
Guilty.
you and I are there. So, and what some people don't know about is you and I went through a moral dilemma of how much to be visible on Instagram, right? And how much to really say some of the things we say. It took me years to make peace with saying that. But I was like, I lived in my own bubble, like we were talking about it before we hit record, right? And I know we still live in that bubble in many ways, and we still hold back. So I really enjoy that perspective of what is your worldview? Does it align with your worldview? What will you not compromise on? And I think that is very important for yoga teachers to recognize and not just blindly follow this course and this free masterclass and, this one said this thing in a book and hence maybe it's right. I was in a panel with wonderful yoga teachers recently, and they kept referring to, this person has written a book, so they should be good. And I found myself smiling because I'm like, come on, this is one of the problems in the yoga industry, right? Anybody can write a book and create a course. So, and now I'm still going off on a tangent, but I'll reel myself back in. So what would you think? What are the major issues with appropriation in the yoga world?
See, that's a that's a very loaded question because there's quite a few, and the harsh reality, and I'll start by giving a disclaimer. The harsh reality is because it actually is such deep work. It actually is such a wide, far-reaching amount of work that for a lot of yoga teachers, it probably wouldn't even make sense to kind of even explore the scope of that, right? It's geared more towards studios, larger yoga organizations, larger yoga-related businesses. That is the reality. So I'll say it and I'll share a few terms, and then I would invite the listeners to kind of see if let's say if they are a studio owner, if they are a yoga business, if they are in the capacity where they can chip away and make a little difference, then I'll leave that as food for thought. Mm-hmm. But I think some of the major issues that underpin cultural appropriation, outside of the obvious, right? The namaste, the bindi, putting the Ganesha statue. Outside of that is capitalism, because what drives all these trends, what drives all this sometimes misrepresentation is good old-fashioned money, right? The commodification and the extraction. And who is benefiting from it? That's why I said it's very interesting to ask that question. Who is benefiting from this? From this commodification and the extraction. A slightly more academic term, if you will, but what also underpins, and this is broadly speaking, even outside of yoga, is this concept of the other. I spoke about it briefly. This concept of it's called Orientalism, where the other is looked at as exotic, is fetishized, is given this status that is different from you. And what that does is it kind of says that, we have all these ancient texts, yogic texts, they made a lot of sense, but they were written thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. Now we, as in modern yoga, predominantly North American, European culture, people with power, people in positions of power are the new experts. And we will decide who gets to be the disseminators of this information. We get to decide who maintains order, because there's this clear divide that I see in, I speak about it often in terms of the East versus the West. The East is mystical, but so chaotic. The West is modern and so rational. So this whole concept, which goes back to colonization of of these practices being primitive, these practices being savage, these practices linked to sorcery. So let's suppress them. Let's shut them down. And I've said it before, as someone of Indian descent growing up in India, it took me so much longer to access these teachings. They're mainstream now. By the time Satya comes of age, she can do any kind of yoga, philosophy, or anything that genre in India, but they were not around. They were wiped, kind of dipping into colonization from Orientalism. But it's true, because that leads to oppression. And the oppression here is very clearly an uneven distribution of power. So if you look at it, who decides whose voice matters and whose voice does not? I think of it as the classic, like a gatekeeper. Who decides that this is yoga and this is not? Who decides that this person is an expert and this person is not? Think about it. Most YTTs in North America follow a curriculum that has been defined by Yoga Alliance. But how did that come into place? Now India's catching up, and we've got the Ministry of Ayush that has had its own curriculum. And I see it playing out, right? I see schools advertising YA approved or certified and Ayush certified. But that's a new thing. For the longest time, this curriculum was designed, the books, the suggested reading, the speakers who would come. I lived in Toronto for so many years, and I would go to the yoga conference, right? It's a big, big thing. Not once I saw an Indian teacher, a person of color. Yeah. It's not that they weren't around. It's not that their knowledge has miraculously appeared in the last 5 years because of them being Indian. They've always had that, but they never had a platform. They never had, forget center stage, any stage, right? And I think the last thing I would say is, again, using a slightly academic term, but this whole spiritual but not religious, when I was young, there used to be a show called Whose Line Is It Anyway? And for me, I think of spiritual but not religious as whose culture is it anyway? Because in North America, especially in the United States, we have this huge thing, right? Right of speech, freedom of speech, this self-appointed agency, where the worldview is that, yeah, sure, you can trace this origin back to India or to South Asia, but I don't need anyone's permission. I can chant this the way I want to. The essence can be used by anybody without conforming to any sort of standards that were existing in place. And when we get into this larger debate of, is that right or is that wrong? You would see that in most cases when, sometimes I'll say something on social media and someone says, who are you to say it? And, they have a point. Who am I to say it, right? I am someone from the source culture who is saying it. But in most cases, the counter agreement is, let's say a mantra, for example, right? I love mantras, right? You have all kinds of mantras floating around in all kinds of meters, and different sing songs and acoustic bands and rap bands and so on and so forth. So it's enough to connect with the energy of the mantra, with the Shakti, with the primordial energy. It doesn't matter if your meter is correct. It doesn't matter if your pronunciation is correct. It doesn't even matter if you are now mixing two mantras together, because you are tapping into, because you're tapping into this universal power that technically does not belong to anybody. So this is the chunk that, and I must say that, spiritual but not religious, or the colonization or the decolonization, at the base of all of that, again, they spin on the wheel of capitalism. Yes. And that's why I said, as yoga teachers who for most parts, definitely struggle financially or try to figure that bridge, and, not all of us are in for the money. That might seem, okay, that's great, Vikram. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that great nugget. What am I supposed to do with it? And I may or may not have a tangible answer for you that what can you do about it. But I would just kind of end this segment or this question by saying that kind of ask yourself that who is benefiting from your commodification, from this extraction, and who is getting harmed? What is getting harmed? Because most times you don't ask that question.
There's so much you gave us in that response. I want to ask you some very direct questions. And I hope you don't hold back, because I feel these are things the listeners are wondering about. Sometimes they ask, and I feel they should be asking these questions more openly, more boldly, because I believe it comes from a very sincere place. So a couple of things I want to get into. Should one have to spend money to learn about appropriation? Okay, and we can pick any of these up. I'll give you a few, see where you want to go. Okay, because I feel like adding to that, should you be learning about appropriation from Indian yoga teachers? Okay, I'm not a fan of the term South Asian, because I feel, this, 8 countries, each country so diverse, so unique, so rich. So by extension, if you want to say South Asian yoga teachers, or people who have some part of some Indian descent in them. Okay, so there's that. Is there a difference if you are born and raised in India, okay, versus you are born and raised in another part of the world, where you have different cultures, right? You have your Indianness, but you're also raised, say, in America or Canada, for that matter. Does that influence you? And I'm going to throw a lot at you, and I can repeat all of this if needed. And I've sometimes seen well-intentioned yoga teachers who will donate something back to India. Is that acceptable? Is that somehow a new bar of, okay, now cultural appropriation box check? Okay. It happened during the COVID crisis in India, for example, right? And I also, one last thought here, and I don't know if you want to pick up on it. I always tell yoga teachers, the first way to avoid doing appropriation work is not to make yoga your full-time job. That's where I think yoga studio owners have really missed the mark. But anyway, again, there's a debate there, so I'm not going to go into that unless you want to. So where should one learn appropriation from? Is Indianness, if I can use that word, a factor to consider? Should people come to us just because we're brown and we know when and how to say namaste? I'm just going to joke about that one, but yeah.
So I'll just quickly give that, let's say for the sake of argument, if I taught for 12 years, I actually said namaste at the end of my class for all of those 12 years. And I didn't give it a second thought. And when I saw this debate flaring up, and everyone kind of pitching in their 2 cents, my first thought was, how does it even make a difference?
Yes.
Because namaste is, to put it simply, a term that has no direct correlation with yoga per se.
Yes.
It's the intermingling of yoga with Indian culture, and I wouldn't say South Asian, right? No one really says namaste in Kashmir or Pakistan or Bangladesh, right?
Correct.
They have a different greeting, maybe Nepal. So it's just an intermingling. So I don't even get that big question that, because the Katha Upanishad verse 3, chapter 2, verse 3 speaks nothing about namaste. And there's no namaste in anything, So I'm going to go back to that to say that, two different Indians will give you different answers to what constitutes cultural appropriation, right? So who's right?
Yes.
Who gets to decide what yoga culture is? There is no yogic text that speak of culture. There's only practices. So let's say if I was initiated into the Sri Vidya Tantra lineage, then I have a clear set of practices, and I do those practices, and the end goal of that practices is mukti, moksha, right? That's the end goal of those practices. And similarly, all the other schools, all the other sampradayas, lineages, they have their own set of practices. But no one's telling you to do, this fast forward to modern day yoga conversations. Am I using my self-appointed agency to speak for all Indians, to speak for South Asians as to what yoga culture is? Recently I saw something about what playlist should be used or what artist should be played. So where does that come from? If you say, Vikram, can you break down Sutra 1.4 for me? I'll be sure. I'll break down Sutra 1.4 for you. There's a text, it's codified, and I can break it down for you. By default, it's a no-brainer that if your goal is to enhance someone's concentration, you would not add variables that disrupt that concentration, right?
Mhm.
So whether you
Yes.
play, I don't know, Celtic soft music, or whether you play Anushka Sharma's soft sitar, the end goal is the same. So in modern day parlance, we have very clearly said that these are things that we should do, we should not do, because I am Indian and I know better, and I've given myself this self-appointed agency. But to me, that's as bad as me getting mad about bear yoga or ganja yoga or naked yoga or something like that, because there is no mention of that too. They are
Mhm.
evolution that we see in modern day yoga, as is
Mhm.
playing music or any other thing that someone might frown upon, right?
Mhm.
So me trying to bring an Indian perspective to
Mhm.
what actually has no roots,
Mhm.
to textual conceptual yoga is a
Mhm.
baseless conversation. So where is that coming from? So
Mhm.
I could say it, and I would give you a list of Indian artists. If you ask someone else, they would give a list of whatever artists are in part of their community. But
Mhm.
how is that any relevant? How is that correct?
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
when did that become the new norm?
Correct. Mhm. Mhm.
So that's on that piece about, and also I should add that cultural appropriation in terms of context is very different for what it means to different people. We are still
Yes.
untangling
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
collective grouping of calling everybody Hindu. We are still
Mhm.
untangling
Mhm.
that. For convenience sake, let's group
Mhm.
everybody together who are of more or less a similar faith, I don't know, ethnicity, and call them Hindus. That was just a collective
Mhm.
grouping. It served no purpose. It actually stripped away people of very
Yes.
different social views, political views, ethical views, identities, and
Mhm.
and grouped them together. And I kind of see the same grouping happen under like yoga culture. This is the
Mhm.
yoga culture.
Mhm.
It has no base. It has no continuity. It actually even has no what's the word for it? No precedence for it. It's all
Yes.
made up.
Mhm. It is made up. So true. Mhm.
So kind of leaves me thinking that, to go back to your very first question, I don't know. I honestly don't know if someone should pay for cultural appropriation or not. So I was saying this to you before we hit record, that when I I was visiting Canada last month, and I went and spent about 4 hours with about 12 teachers at a yoga
Mhm.
studio,
Mhm.
and I did get paid for my time. So I think getting paid for your time to have a meaningful dialogue, to have a conversation, um, to raise awareness, to ask questions, to give people some food for thought, to educate them, to speak about history, roots of yoga,
Mhm.
yes. But to kind of have that as your niche, to kind of
Yes.
have that as your
Yes.
big ticket
Mm.
item, to kind of
Mhm.
being implicit in the capitalistic system of
Mm.
still selling yoga,
Mm.
selling the modern concise yoga with its list of to dos and not to dos.
Mm.
I think that doesn't fit my worldview personally.
Yes, I have to jump in because I think you're like hitting the nail on the head with this one. And we chatted before. What the listeners don't know is we talk for half an hour before we actually hit record. We were chatting before recording, right? And we were talking about um, if someone is building their entire yoga career just on appropriation, right? I was asking you, is that a red flag? Right? Can you give me Sutra 23 from chapter 2 with nothing to do with appropriation, just pure yoga as mentioned in that text, right? Um, and if everything is if you're coming at it only with one view, right? To me, that is a problem personally, and it could just be a personal thing, right? I want not somebody's notion of yoga. I want unadulterated yoga when I study with
Hmm.
someone. And for me, if someone is not, and I'll simplify this for the listeners. I should be able to get some asana type of, excuse me, some asana type of uh, questions answered if I'm suffering from something, right? I should be able to get some pranayama and kosha type of answers if I'm having that, some deep philosophy thing, some life issue if I'm running into how do I use the yoga to help me. And I should be able to get so much more contextualization and not just one particular narrow lens of appropriation is all. I think my problem is appropriation is all what yoga has become about, right? And not even like really moving the needle, just circling around the topic. So I think it's an important thing to recognize for people listening, right? Because I've always believed this: the students are sincere. Sometimes they end up at the wrong door, and if everything they're being asked to do is just appropriation work, then something is missing. That is a part of what we have to do, but it's not the main and only. Well, main might be interpreted differently, but it's not the only thing. So I really think you're hitting the nail on the head with that one.
Yeah, because I also want to add, right? So we spoke about yamas, niyamas, right? They're part of the Ashtanga yoga from the sutras. And what is that yamas? What is the Ashtanga yoga supposed to do? It's supposed to bring about viveka khyati, right? That discriminative discernment. So, I live in India right now. I'm Hindu, Indian, all the labels that can be attached to me. But I don't subscribe to a lot of right-wing Hindu nationalist views because they don't fit my worldview. Similarly, when identifying myself, I identify more as being of the predominant Sanatana Dharma, right? That I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Not this collective Hindu grouping. So there is no one size fits all. There is no efficacy in it. There is no sustainability in it. And that's why I get a little, I think that's why I even reached out to you. It's like, let's talk about this because I see this push towards this, wear this hat, this one size fits all.
Yes.
This one size fits all is not possible. And also, no matter how much we try, as Indian yoga teachers or non-Indian yoga teachers, this is an embodied practice. This is not a list of to-dos and not to-dos. This is not, don't lock your knee and put so much pressure on the standing leg. It's not as easy, as simple as that. And I want to keep bringing the listeners to that please we live in a Google friendly world. Everything is available at literally your fingertips. So when you're doing your research, when you're kind of looking out, look at the larger picture. Don't look at these quick fixes because I will call them for what they are. They're quick fixes.
Absolutely. They're distractions too.
Yeah. Also, we also hear this word tokenism, right? And someone asked me, so what does that look like? And I said, tokenism is, I only had black and white, I only had white cushions in my room and I put a bunch of rainbow cushions in my room. That's tokenism. I come from a diversity inclusion background, right? That's diversification. It's not decolonization. Decolonization, it's a very, I use it too. It's a very popular hashtag, right? So if you're really trying to look at this broader picture of decolonizing yoga, you got to look at an equal distribution of power, more conversations, more engagement, more representation, putting the people who you actually will give a pen and say, all right, your signature is going to make that change. Not just randomly having guest speakers, keynote speakers, getting the pause and out of guilt, you're like, okay, we must have someone come board. Let's give them the X amount of dollars, or let's feature, a couple of colored teachers in the roster. Yeah. So that, that term gets thrown around. Yeah. And here's the reality, things that I found out kind of going deeper in that work in a lot of communities. I mean, if I could have the best intentions, I live in a small rural town. I have absolutely zero teachers of color. None of those initiatives would make sense because I physically have zero teachers of color. What can I do? Should I just say, well, my work is done. I live in predominantly a very white town, if you will. So I should do no work? No.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Kind of like having people think of these broader, larger conversations, not limiting the scope of this work.
And I think something that's missed usually is just, firstly, this work takes time. Okay, this work takes time, and I believe people should step into it only if they really want to do it, not do it because that's the new trend, or because, and you and I completely align on this. There's no shame, there's no guilt. Everything's in the past. Just the present and what you do in future is what really matters. And because sometimes I notice people shame and blame people, and and then people just do it because you're guilting them to do it, and that's a bad idea. Uh, but that's not what I want to bring up. What are some of the mistakes or missteps that someone takes trying to do appropriation work? If you think we've already covered it, we can skip it. But because here's what I see, Vikram. I see people thinking, oh, okay, I Googled it. These are my top 3 hits. Boom, I'm done. I read this book. I listened to this podcast. I posted on Instagram. Done. Check. I'm done. Right? And you and I know that really does nothing. Right? It just might temporarily, it's like eating chocolate. You'll feel good for like that moment. I don't like chocolate. But anyway, so what are some of the missteps that people can avoid or at least should know about, if any?
Yeah, I think look past the low-hanging fruits. Look past the bindi and the henna or the mehndi or the playlist or the namaste, or should I use Sanskrit in class or not? Like be genuine about those. Be genuine about those, because if they were regular practices in your life, then you would not have those doubts. When people think about stuff like that, when I wear a kurta pajama, it's not a costume. It's just clothes for me. It's clothes that I wear on a regular basis. Sometimes fancier versions of those clothes when it's a festival or something like that, So I would say that I sometimes say the asana name in Sanskrit and sometimes in English. I just naturally what comes out, comes out.
Me too.
I was saying earlier, I said namaste at the end of the class because to me, that was a way of expressing my thank you, bringing my palms together, bowing my head, closing my eyes. No one could see that, right? The lights are dimmed. People are already resting in Shavasana. I would say namaste and go. To me, it served a practical purpose. It let me express my gratitude and people knew class was over. This whole debate about, oh, it's a greeting and so on and so forth. Anything in that genre, those are low-hanging fruits. I want to bring everybody back to the same thing. I don't even know how many people who would fall in this larger culture of Indian descent, Indians, whereas diasporas. I don't even know how large that number is. So how can you ever get a clear answer?
Yeah.
You should see looking beyond that. I get it. Those are important issues. If you're a brand new teacher, you're struggling to find your voice. Sure, a helping hand would be great. But it's kind of like what I say about 200-hour YTTs. That's awesome. I started with one myself. I didn't just like fall down and said, okay, cool, I know it all. So understanding that anything in this genre, including this, is part of a larger conversation. Now, how far you want to go with it, that's your choice. But understanding that it never ends, because there's, like I said, things like capitalism and decolonization and oppression, these are deep-rooted issues. They exist in multiple societies. They exist in multiple genres, ethnicities. It's not just limited to yoga. True. Yoga has just gotten the flashlight now and everyone's talking about it. And sure, it's a good thing. We should. But that's what I would say, look past the low-hanging fruits. And it's absolutely fine if you are happy with where you are. That's great.
Yes.
But understanding that is not the end. I think that would be the biggest avidya. That would be an act of ignorance, a conscious act of ignorance, that it stops there. So please go on to whatever you're doing. And just like your yoga education, it's an ongoing process. It's not overnight. It's you.
Correct. I think that's so valuable. Just don't reach only for the low hanging fruit. Right? I think that is really valuable. It's simple. What I like about conversations with you is it's simple. It's practical. It's not wound up and tangled where you have to do 5 courses to figure out what you just said. What does appropriation work look like in India? Because not sometimes. I mean, there are appropriated versions of yoga all over the globe, right? And it's there in India too. And correct me if I'm wrong. So what does this wave or trend look like in India?
I think the biggest, not so much in the alternative styles, you get the the occasional face yoga, beer yoga,
Mm.
thankfully marijuana is still not legal in this country. So you would get into trouble if you offered any ganja yoga classes. Naked yoga
Uh-huh.
would not fly
Oh
at
my
all.
gosh, no,
Uh,
I can. Oh, I can just see that
uh,
getting into.
yeah,
Yeah,
can you imagine?
I'm scared
But
to imagine actually.
yeah, don't imagine. I take it back. Um, what's rampant is the capitalism. See,
Mm,
everyone knows that you can make a buck or two, to put it mildly, with yoga, right?
mm,
And that
mhm,
concept is coming here. Again, some more ethical, conscious players, if you will, and some
mhm,
just riding the wave. The other day
mhm.
I saw something of, how um, you get certain ads like linked to your personality or your
Yeah.
post or
Mhm,
whatever. I don't know how
mhm.
those things work, but I saw something about, are you instead of an entrepreneur, it said a yogpreneur, you know,
Ah.
and it was catering to the Indian market, and it's very common here to see someone who is a full time yoga teacher. Very very rare. Among some of the other things that I do, I was also the black sheep because I was a yoga teacher. People couldn't
Mm,
believe like that was my full time job. Thankfully, I was living in Canada, so I didn't get too much flack from my from my well wishers and relatives, if you will. But that's common here too. You
mhm,
find a lot of pop up studios,
mhm,
yoga shalas,
mhm,
YTTs. I'm in Goa
mhm.
right now. It's picking up post the pandemic, but South Goa has tons of yoga school. Rishikesh, you can just walk down a road for a kilometer and you'll probably hit 15, maybe more yoga teacher training schools. So I think the commercial aspect of it, the
Mhm.
capitalist aspect of it, the fact that you can make money off yoga is very rapidly growing here. And it's not my place to say
But
whether
can
that's
I?
right or wrong.
Yes, and I want to just. I always like to bring this up when this comes up. Is we've got to recognize that w- economically there is a difference between America, Canada, parts of Europe, and India, right? And the struggle for survival is real. Like in India, with the population and just I would throw in colonization and how we have dealt with all of that for hundreds of years, and just access to education and poverty is rampant, and so and I think population is one of our biggest problems. Is just the struggle is real, right? So just throwing that in there for people to recognize. It's not here where the government is giving you unemployment, uh, and when COVID hits, you're getting paychecks sent home to you, uh, eh, eh, and it's social security. It's very different, and you can't look at your culture and expect, oh, but it happens in India too, and hence it's okay, I can do it.
For sure.
That's kind of what I want to bring up. I'm
For
not
sure.
saying
And
that's
no,
okay either, but there is uh, societal, economical, cultural complexities that are not spoken about enough.
100% totally agree. And it's true. Appropriation is is not very tangible, intangible here, right? Because the
Mhm,
connection with the source culture is obviously kept intact. In fact, it's
mhm,
emphasized. You know,
mhm,
um, a lot of people, I meet a lot of people, and in their claim to fame, or one of the big things that's in their yoga resume, is did my teacher training in India. It's a big thing, right? Like
yes,
you went to
yeah,
India, you went to the source, um, and like most places, um, who you train with is what's important, not where
oh
you
my
train with.
gosh, yes, it's like
You know,
going to Italy and saying I ate pizza in Italy, or I went to one cooking class and now I can make great Italian food.
yeah,
uh
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So I think, but again, it's interesting, and I'm really glad you brought that point because it's the appropriation here is more caught up with capitalism, and
Mhm,
unfortunately, it's not the average person who's making that money.
mhm,
It's the bigger organizations. So
mhm,
yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because that dynamic is here too. The difference, it's
mhm.
very apparent here between the have and the have-nots, but that dynamic
Yes.
plays out here
Mm,
as well.
mhm,
So
mhm.
um, there is a lot of genuine teachers out there trying to make a living, fit in the system, and it's a harder fight against ethics here, if you will, as
Yes,
opposed to
I bet.
in the West. And I
But don't
definitely
you?
think
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I can see sometimes, for me, we spoke earlier about choosing your worldview and acting in alignment with that. I can see someone having a lot more conflicts here because, I definitely have the privilege of having taught for so many years in North America and kind of being where I am, kind of paying my dues earlier, if you will. But if I was a brand new teacher, it's not that easy here as well. So that does play into it. That does play into it because you've chosen something that you think is a very noble profession. You want to make a difference genuinely, but then you also have to pay the bills. And that's where the question comes. So yeah, the capitalism, just like the West, is ingrained in larger corporations, not at the ground level, if you will.
Fair enough. And this might be a little off topic, but I'm going to go here very quickly. I also feel culturally, and correct me if I'm wrong, we were never raised, and when I say we, I'm referring specifically to you and me, we were never raised, or at least me, to sell yoga. Right? We are not raised to market our culture. And you and I have had conversations about this when we first connected, right? Like, how much of ourselves do we put out? It's a dilemma that I've had for very long, especially pre-podcast days, because a lot of just broadcasting all of this and myself as part of this and come to me, I'm the expert, felt very culturally complex to me, right? And it's a lot of times people say, oh, the West has helped revive yoga in India. Not really, right? And that's such a, I'll just say what it is. It's a stupid statement. It's an ignorant statement. Here, capitalism and packaging everything is second nature. But I think a lot of Indian people struggle with that because of the worldview or your mindset and ethics and culture and how you live. So it's always going to be lagging behind compared to the West. And now, yes, we're trying to even out the playing field. Ayush has stepped in. The government is waking up a little bit in this regard, and they're trying to do something. But it's hard. It's culturally hard, and it's also in many. If you live outside of India, especially, it's painful to step into the yoga world. Right? It's traumatic sometimes to see what happens. And I know so many people have run away from yoga because of that in studios, specifically studios. So it's just, I feel it's harder culturally for me to broadcast my yoga and myself. I do it. The reason you know this, one of the reasons we created the podcast was because nobody gave us a platform. So I was like, I'm just going to give all of us a platform, whether anybody listens or not, I'm going to do it. And that's how this podcast really was born. But it's just culturally it's way harder for us to just slap on a course and say, come to me, I think, and I could be wrong.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's I think it's that fine balance, right? Great book, by the way, by Rohit Mystery. It's that fine balance that we have to find as a teacher. Obviously with the identities we most relate with, and it's true. I see it. I because I've been living here for a while. I am a teacher. I am an Indian teacher in India. Which is a very different, very new experience. And I completely agree. If I did not have the background that I did, it would be a very different story for me. If I wanted to primarily support myself and did not want to be a sellout.
A sellout. I actually like that. I think we have, at least I have, these inbuilt filters, my worldview, and I always have to check that before I put something out there. But I know it's late for you, so I don't want to, I can talk about this with you for like days probably, but what can we leave the listeners? Firstly, if we've missed something else, feel free to bring that up. But can we leave the listeners with some homework? I mean, I love yoga homework. If anybody gives me yoga homework, I'm all for it. But something to take away from this in terms of actionable items, if any.
I love that. It's a nice loop. So I say this in all lectures, wherever I get a chance. I say, I love saying it. So anyone who would listen, I'll say it to them. So it's very important if you are teaching or practicing yoga that you have a working definition of yoga to you, because we have lots of definitions of yoga in text, you know, uh, from skill in action to balance to cessation of the fluctuation of the mind. You know, there's lots of codified definitions of yoga. So if you are practicing or teaching yoga, write your working definition of yoga, and I'm sure it'll grow and evolve with time. And then that should be a good benchmark of where your role in terms of appropriation lies in it. You know, like I said, there's few things that I will not do. I will not do because it's not about the money anymore. You know, it's that line you spoke about, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, that I will not cross. So if you're not sure where you fall on that spectrum, define that for you and let that definition help you choose your actions. Wonderful. Right? We spoke about discernment, right? Let that discernment come from there. The second I would say is that look at your current practices, and I guess I'm broadly speaking to both teachers and practitioners, and see that could they potentially cause harm to someone? You know, could they be offensive to someone? Not from a cancel culture, not from because 10 influencers said that this is a bad idea, but like genuinely, you know. Don't ask your Indian neighbor, because like I said, and I'll say it again, your Indian neighbor cannot speak for me. I'll just leave it at your neighbor and me. You know, just because your auntie said that means nothing. Just because I said it, it means nothing. A lot of times people will tell me, "Oh, a teacher in India told me," but that means nothing. You know, so let that come. Let that come from you, because no one can collectively speak for a group of people. My version of "don't do this" will not line up with someone else's. So objectively ask yourself, if you study the yamas, you would like to practice ahimsa in real life. See, is your action causing any himsa? And if it is, think if you'd like to change it, especially if it's tied to money, because that's where it gets tricky, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And the last thing I would say in the broader genre of homework is go beyond this podcast. Go beyond whatever work you're currently doing or no work that you're currently doing, and kind of be a part of the larger change. Unfortunately, the change has been categorized and boxed into this very commercially viable package, but it's not pretty. This package looks very pretty, you know, and retails at X amount of dollars.
So and it's convenient. You buy that and you're done. Yeah.
Please, if you feel called to buy that, please buy that. But just like, you know, you went for a 200-hour YTT and then you grew, you evolved, you asked those deep questions and you said, cool, I should do this. I should learn this and have this to teach. And your mind expanded. So know that if this is the very first time, I doubt it, but if this is the very first time you're coming in the genre of cultural appropriation, let this be the seed for as much expansion as there is possible. I don't think this is not a closed conversation, because let's face it, is capitalism going to disappear from yoga or from otherwise? No. Is decolonization going to be a reality for some time? Maybe not. Which means that it'll slowly chug along. But if you are an active participant, then you're willing to put in whatever your work is, whatever that looks like for you. I can't dictate that and give you 7 things to do. I can if you want me to, but that'll only scratch the surface. Yeah.
I'm just going to add one more to that, because it's a wonderful list. And don't get influenced by herd mentality. I think it's just, you know, you see everyone doing it and everyone doing it in this one particular way, or at least that's just visible because of social media. And especially if you consume a lot of yoga stuff on social media, you don't have to be part of the herd. And look deeper is what I would just add to that. Because sometimes people say, oh, everybody's doing this, so I'm also going to do this. Maybe it's right. And those numbers can influence you, but is that the metric we should be looking at? It makes sense if you're looking at product sales, you know, but expand your awareness a little bit is what I would leave the listeners with. This has been...
I'll say one more thing.
You
And
can say
if you
more than
happen
one.
to, just one, because it's true. I mean, I'm wide awake, as you can tell. It's 11, but I'm like, yeah, sure, let's go. Let's put an all-nighter. Just put pause. Let me get some coffee. I'll wake myself up. Anyway, um, if you are in any position of power, so I am in a position of power, right? I have a voice. I lecture. I'm connected to studios, to some organizations. If you are in a position of power and you see something that falls in that genre, don't think that it's not my problem. It's someone else's problem. Ask that. I've started asking a lot of questions that I did not ask. For a very long time, I just lived in this bubble of ignorance where I didn't think these things mattered. And it's true. You know, for these things have been around for, I guess, as long as humanity and any sort of, oppression has been identified or codified, but they've been around for as long as humanity, right? And I'm just going to stick to the yoga world since I'm not a historian. Ask those questions. Don't think that it's not your problem. Don't think that it's someone else's work. Don't think that some Indian person has to do it if you are not an Indian person or a teacher of color or a person of color. Ask whoever you work with. Ask those questions. Because a lot of times, silence is taken as consent. I think for a long time, a lot of people took my silence as consent. And I would even be used in conversations. Well, he didn't say anything. He's Indian. And it's true. It made me think that. Why do I not say something? Because I really, I lived in ignorance, and B, I thought it's not my problem. You know, I'm just here to teach my class and then go home after that. So yeah, if you are in that position, then ask, question. If it doesn't add up, ask, because that's how also you build awareness, by asking. Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. I like how you said, basically don't sit on the sidelines if you're in a position of power. And even if you're not an Indian person, you can still say something. Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. There is so much in here that I hope the listeners will spend time to reflect on and to unpack. And as always, you are no stranger to this podcast. And I know this is not by any means your final appearance on it. You add so much value to this platform. I will link where people can connect with you. Wandering Matt on Instagram. And I know you have been doing a lot more work where people can actually access you in terms of online education and retreats and just writing about yoga and helping yoga teachers feel more connected to their practice. So I will link all of that in the show notes. This is wonderful. Thank you for suggesting that we have this conversation. I know I jumped at it the moment you said we should do it. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
At the risk of, ruffling some feathers, namaste.
Thanks, Vikram. Thank you so much for listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. Just a reminder that all these episodes are now available on YouTube, and you can see Vikram and I have this conversation on video. I know a lot of you use these podcast episodes as continuing education in your yoga teacher trainings and resources. So feel free to check that out at Aham Yoga on YouTube. Every episode, all the 110 episodes are now video episodes as well. Okay, that's it from my end. Make sure you are signed up for our newsletter. The link is in your podcast description or on our website. And I will see you next week with another guest, another conversation. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.